Alright, so I figure we'll go into another one that we've been meaning to do for a while. These two gambling-themed movies. I guess you could say card game gambling movies, but obviously since we're dealing with two different games, I think the gambling sticks out much more in the plots, even despite the fact that Mickey Rosa is very adamant in 21 about it's not gambling and don't call it gambling when you know the outcome of the game. Otherwise, you're going to get stuck in a place that you don't want to be in and basically fuck everything up. So before we get into the kind of going back and forth thing, I think it's worth noting that 21 is a movie that I really, really liked a lot when it came out in 2008, and I still like it now. Maybe not to that extent. And of course, the reason I bring that up immediately is because, kind of doing the back and forth thing here, I just want it to be clear that this video is in no way intended to be, this is why Rounders is good and why 21 sucks. Despite the fact that most of the video will probably sound like that. So, and to start off with, you can see, I think the reason also that I'm worried about sounding like that is so much of where I think 21 falls short between these two is that Rounders does so much in its first 5 minutes, in its opening scene. You can pinpoint what it does right and what most of 21 kind of leaves to be desired a little more. So when it starts off, it has it starts with the narration and Damon talking to us and going through his whole thought process as this game with John Malkovich goes on, and it's normally narration would almost be in the way, you'd rather the characters just kind of shut the fuck up and then we just kind of watch the game and how it plays out. But there's, first of all, just something just engaging in general in Damon's narration throughout the entire movie. But it also makes the game more tense, and it's especially when it gets to the point where it's the outcome that he doesn't suspect it will be. And it sort of lets us in as an audience in a way that 21 almost feels a bit cold in the way that it handles that. Because when you watch Rounders and the bets they make and all that, even without necessarily the guidance of Damon's narration, you could still follow pretty easily what's going on and what exactly the stakes are. And when there isn't a problem for the protagonist. And as far as 21 goes, obviously Blackjack is a really easy game to understand, but the trouble is the whole counting cards aspect and what exactly it is that they're doing, which maybe it's something I'm not smart enough to do or something, but it feels very much like there is a distance between what's happening with the characters and the audience and how we perceive it. Because most of it, while we get, inside Damon's head through the narration as we go throughout Rounders, 21 kind of explains what it's doing throughout the entire movie and what the whole scheme of the thing is, basically in montages that seem to not really have much of a regard for people keeping up with it, and I can respect that to a degree in maybe a different movie. Especially if it's, a way of cutting down on exposition or something like that. But no, it just kind of feels like they just didn't care whether the audience knew exactly what was going on or not, because the movie is so focused on just being flashy about itself. And I just think immediately that's something that's highlighted at the very start of Rounders. That's kind of an issue throughout 21. You get you feel much more kind of invested in the stakes in Rounders' case, so there is that. But you do look at it from the other standpoint of what's going on behind the scenes with the writing and the direction, where you have where Rounders is directed by John Dahl, who had done Red Rock West and would go on to do Joyride, in an episode of just about every TV series you probably watched and liked. And the writers are Brian Kaufman and David Levine, who I praised immensely when me and my brother did the top 15 video a couple months ago. 21 is from the director of Legally Blonde, which, of course, I have no issues with Legally Blonde whatsoever, but you can see where maybe there's, he's an odd choice for this material, you could say. And it is, yeah, there is some hope when you look at the fact that it's based on a book by Ben Mesrick, a non-fiction book that most of the people involved had issues with. There was like the use of composite characters and a shitload of liberties. But the reason that might give you hope is obviously there is another very famous movie with a lot of sort of technical dialogue, I guess you could call it, based on a book by Mesrick, which was The Social Network. So, but The Social Network, this is not quite. So there is that. And yeah, and another thing I was talking about with the opening scenes is when you go into the opening scene of Rounders, it kind of feels like, it almost feels like we're watching a climax early when we see the first game between him and Malkovich. And it's almost like as it goes on that you realize, when it goes into the next scene and we realize this is just the setup, that this isn't going to be one of those endings that, or one of those beginnings that's an ending that we eventually circle back around to. Because it doesn't need that hook. It can hook us with the first scene and gradually go on about its way in the timeline. Did 21 commit the sin of we don't really have an opening hook, so let's just use the ending and circle back around, and maybe throw in some misdirection? It might. So, so you see what I mean? I do like 21, and I do want to get into the things I do like about it, and we'll kind of, like I said, just go back and forth here. I guess to do that, we can talk about the characters, where the main sort of thing in Rounders that's kind of at the core of it is this friendship between Matt Damon and Edward Norton, Mike and Worm. And the thing here is, when you watch this movie, you can tell how good the character work is, because if this were a lesser movie, we would spend the whole movie angrily shouting at the screen, why does Damon keep falling into Worm's traps? Like, why does he keep going back to him and being his friend when every single time he fucks up and gets Mike in even more trouble? And it's just continuous. Like, even when we're reaching the point in like the chronology of the movie, and it's like, this is the point in just about any movie where they would like part ways, where Damon would just get sick of his shit and just call him out once and for all, and then cut him out of his life and whatever. And no, he just sort of keeps backing him up because that's the way their friendship is. And the reason that we don't do that, I mean, you can do that, but the reason it doesn't hinder the movie in any way and the way we view their relationship is just from the very beginning, it sets up why Damon is so loyal to him when he explains why Worm is in prison and he is not. And it's basically one of those cases of, like, you just get a sense that it's almost because of that Damon throughout the whole movie feels like he still kind of owes him in a sense, despite the fact that he is, like, it makes perfect sense that the last time we hear about Worm is after Damon has beaten Malkovich for the last time and says, yeah, I just considered us even at this point. Like, it's and then that's really all it is. And between the two of them also, like, the chemistry between them and the scenes they share together, even if we didn't have a shitload of backstory on just how much Damon has backed him up, but how he has backed him up in return, there would still be something there that just kind of tells us this. And that's a really tricky thing that this movie pulls off that could have really been the death of it and really just kind of made us have no investment in Damon as a character whatsoever, because he just sort of keeps putting himself back in this by constantly going back to Worm regardless of what's happened before, and will no doubtedly happen again. There's even that moment with the state troopers where we get when Damon has finally convinced him to just go away and let him do his thing. And we know Worm well enough now that not only do we know exactly what he's going to do, we can recognize him when he's out of focus in the way background as he's coming up to this game again, and we know exactly how this is going to play out. And so it's like, it's not even just Damon as a character. For us as an audience, it's like Worm just puts us on a continuous loop. It's like fucking Groundhog Day when you hang out with Worm, because it's going to be the same schemes, the same fuck-ups, and the same outcome that ends in potential bodily harm. And it just keeps happening. But like I said, their whole thing, even the scenes with Grandma, when it seems like Damon should be miles away from this by now, the fact that he just keeps getting himself involved in it, should by all means make no sense to us watching from the outside. But it works, and it's just how well the characters are written and how well their friendship is conveyed throughout the movie, and it just all manages to work somehow. And then you bring in characters just kind of in and out of it. Like, Martin Landau, I think, in another case, would be a totally wasted character, and a waste of an actor on top of that. But there's one scene, like, there's one of his introductory scenes where it's when Damon walks in and, like, knows everybody's hand and all that. Which is a good scene in itself, and then the inevitable scene where he has to ask him for the money. And it's like, I think in another movie that's about all his character would have done, but what this movie does with that character, that's so amazing, is that scene in the middle, like that 5-minute scene where they have the dialogue with each other, and it builds up just enough. I can still see people watching this and then wondering, like, why in God's name would Martin Landau give him $10,000 for what he needs to use it for? Especially when he specifically says, "I'm not wealthy by any means." But I feel like there's just enough in there to justify that. Enough to at least, say the movie. And the fact that it is set up that this is... By the time we're at this point in the movie, it's probably a life or death situation. And so I do think there's enough of a relationship established between them, especially in that middle scene, that justifies that. And then there's the one thing that might seem a bit tacked on, and that's the Gretchen Mol thing, where it's he has to have the girlfriend he's constantly letting down because he's going back into that life and everything, and it's like his sort of almost like a way out, where it's like the light at the end of the tunnel of this whole gambling fixation. But that's handled in a couple of interesting ways and unconventional ways that we'll eventually get to. But the main thing with the Gretchen Mol character would be the way this sort of breakup is handled in a scene I've always liked, where it's where she uses the card analogy that she learned from like the knowledge that he taught her about cards and gambling and all that. She uses an analogy with the knowledge he gave her, to basically break up with him, which I think is really good. And that's another, just how well written it is, even with still a character that's like more or less underdeveloped in that whole storyline. If there's one character that I think does need a lot more screen time to really make their presence known, would be John Turturro, who just fits perfectly in a movie like this. But his character is really nothing more than like a stepping stone for the Damon character to get to certain outcomes. So we could have used that. But and that's to go on the characters in 21 also. Where we have Jim Sturgis as our main character, and he's, he was fresh off Across the Universe, and he's pretty much perfectly cast, because he's got to do he's technically a genius, really, but because he's so book smart, he's so naive to the sort of world that he's dragged into by Rosa. And then there is, if you want to talk about, underdeveloped female characters, the way Gretchen Mol is used in Rounders feels like monumental compared to Kate Bosworth just being the cliche. Well, she never would have, shown him the time of day, but now that he's, this suave card counter in Vegas and all that, and he's raking in all this money. Suddenly, PG-13 sex scenes are going to happen because filler, I guess. Because we need sexy shots of Kate Bosworth for the trailer. I don't know. But there is one segment throughout this movie that is absolutely positively cliche, but ultimately I do think kind of works enough, and that is Josh Gad. Josh Gad, like, long before his fame on, like, the... I mean, he probably had his stage work by now, I would say, but he was still, as far as a movie career goes, I remember when this came out, and everybody just assumed he was, like, a discount Jonah Hill. Not even a discount Jonah Hill, but a discount off the discount of Jonah Hill. But now he's obviously established himself, and that goes into the whole story of, yeah, he's friends with the, off the radar people, the outcasts, the nerdy dudes. They're doing the whole robotics thing, and it's like, yeah, he gets involved with the cool crowd and starts making all the money, and he's got Kate Bosworth, and there's neglecting them, and it's that old thing we just kind of have to roll our eyes through until it's over. But the scene ultimately where they make up towards the end, and Josh Gad's like, so now that you told me the whole story, I get it. Like, I probably would have done that too, and it's like that kind of makes up for the obviously cliche direction that goes altogether. And then there's the other characters, like Aaron Yu, who was Shia's friend in Disturbia, kind of brings in the sort of comedy relief that he had in that movie also, and then Jacob Pitts, who a lot of people know from Eurotrip, that would go on to be in Justified, as the guy that kind of ends up becoming antagonistic towards Jim Sturgis when he gets a little too good at what he's doing. So, obviously the characters aren't near strong in 21. They're kind of more like types, but the actors take that as far as they can, which makes it, durable throughout, even when it's sort of falling into cliches. And then that's going into what is probably the strongest and most eye-catching performance in the movie. The one that sort of kind of draws people into the movie to begin with. And that's Spacey, and how really good in this he is. Because the thing is he kind of gets to do both things he's really, really good at. Where he can be sort of, the guy that brings him into this, and then it's like he's got that, trustworthy teacher vibe to him, and he plays that really well. And then there's the other side of it where he gets progressively more shady, and then as it goes on, and then ultimately ending up with him being the antagonist, and it's like just being able to play both important. I feel like there's a lot of this performance in his later performance in Baby Driver. And that sort of balance to it. So obviously, back in the day also when it first came out, it was his performance that, like, really drew me to this movie, and he's really kind of the center of what fire the movie has. So it's got that going for it. But the interesting thing about his presence here is that there's a case. I kind of made fun of this when I was talking about the way it circles back around, but the end being the beginning. And that's the misdirection. But I do kind of like the way that the movie builds up that our main antagonist is going to be Lawrence Fishburne, who is this way over-the-top, old-school security guy. But I kind of like... It gives the movie, like, a certain sort of personality, having a character as over-the-top as this when it comes to what the threats in the movie are. Where it's like, if you can't raise the stakes in a more subtle way, the way Rounders does, just by using the game itself, throw in a guy like Lawrence Fishburne, the old-school security guy who puts on rings to almost beat you to death. His introductory scene where he beats the guy so hard, he's like, okay, count the 10 so we know you don't have brain damage. And it's like, that's actually kind of refreshing like this, and it's kind of the perfect setup that this is the threat of the movie, before it eventually comes around that even though he does remain a threat by all means, that it's really definitely Rosa that ends up being the main antagonist, really. So I do like that sort of misdirection that they play with. But speaking of antagonists in the movies, We have Teddy KGB, played by John Malkovich in Rounders. And there are two kinds of John Malkovich, I have learned. And this is apparently confirmed by Matt Damon in an interview from like a few years ago. There is incredible, amazing, you know, intimidating thespian John Malkovich. And then there's the John Malkovich that's just trolling the fuck out of everybody. And John Malkovich is trolling the fuck out of everybody when he played Teddy KGB with that accent. It was like in that interview, Damon was telling a whole story about the first scene they shot. Before it, everybody was building up Malkovich like it was the greatest thing ever. It's like, holy shit, we actually got Malkovich for this movie. And it's like it was like a countdown to his first shooting day. And it's like even before it was his day to shoot his first scene, everybody was like, everything was a buzz, like, dude, Malkovich is going to be here soon. Like this week, Malkovich is going to be here. And then when he got there, apparently his first scene was that scene, the first time we see him at the end, when Damon shows up and comes back, and he says the whole, you're gonna, have my money, and if you don't, you're mine. And apparently he did that in the most over-the-top, cartoonish fashion possible on purpose to basically amuse himself, because as he predicted, he was met with applause through the whole sort of set because he was Malkovich, and that was it. It didn't matter what he did or what he said. There was just sort of that blind praise of any move he made, and he basically wanted to fuck with them because he knew that going in. That's basically the gist of the story Damon told, and I'm gonna say we can probably take Matt Damon's word for it. It almost sounds like too great to be true. It almost sounds like too good of a story, but I want to believe that that's where Malkovich's whole performance stems from. Especially when it gets to, forget the accent, forget the way he, says certain things. There's the moment when he's talking about the first scene of the movie, and he's talking about how he's basically saying, we've done this before and I basically fucked you. But he says, the last time I stick it in, and he starts to make thrusting motions. He is... there's no other word. He is trolling the fuck out of this movie and everybody in it. And everybody around, in front of the camera, behind the camera. Malkovich fucking played everybody. And it's glorious to behold. Because I still occasionally see him get criticism for the performance. And it's sort of like a Nicolas Cage scenario where it's like, really? You thought Malkovich was playing it like that because he thought that was the best way? No way. John Malkovich knows better. He's fucking with everybody here. And it's amazing. So, with all that being said now, obviously the movies also have sort of different styles, and Rounders does feel a lot more downplayed by comparison because this, even despite Matt Damon himself's presence, this would have been a few years before Ocean's 11. So it's you can't really take that into account. But with 21, we're talking Soderbergh's Ocean's 11, obviously. We're getting severe Ocean's 11 syndrome. And what I mean by that, and I've mentioned this many times before, even despite the fact that I do like Ocean's 11, it really started this horrible trend of movies trying way too hard to be cool and smooth and jazzy about themselves, especially when it's about, people getting away with shit. In casinos, no less. But in this, it really has that sort of... It suffers from the over-coolness factor, really. But the thing about it is that there's the trial run scene. And the funny thing about it is that this isn't necessarily just a trial run for them, but it's kind of a trial run for the style of the movie itself. Where it's like, if you don't care for the style of this trial run, and you think the movie's maybe trying a little too hard, that's probably going to be the way the rest of the movie is. But to their credit, they do, like, they're not necessarily as blatant about it as they are in the trial run, because we got, like the really blatant signals, where it's like, when they do the whole thing, it's like, hey, if we do this thing, it means this thing. If we do this thing, it means this thing. Stuff that it would be impossible for these characters to remember, let alone the audience. Or like I said, like after a while, they just make the audience say, just trust us. If you see something on screen, it makes sense to us anyway. The characters are getting away with something, that's all you need to know. But there's the whole thing, like, the signals probably sound clever on paper. It's only when you see them in action that you're like, oh, these people would get caught in 2 seconds. Which is pretty much what happens. If they get found out pretty early by Lawrence Fishburne just watching the fucking camera. And that's all it takes. The whole putting the hands behind the back thing, and like then he's one of, I mean, to their credit, obviously this is a trial run, but I mean still, and it's like it's a whole setup put together by Spacey and the rest of the crew and all that, to basically haze him to make sure that he can, you know, keep his head in the game. The fact that they're in this super secret underground place where this, you know, super secretive gambling is going on, and one of the code words is magazine. So the guy fits it into a sentence by saying, yeah, I found out about this place in a magazine. Yeah, if you're in an underground place, that's not going to draw attention at all. That's not going to be a sentence that stands out whatsoever. But maybe that's just, yeah. So, but that's also the reason I criticize that, is because in the movie we're still in Jim Sturgis' perspective, and we don't know right now that this is a whole big setup. So Sturgis, being the fucking MIT genius that he is, should have been able to deduce, wait, there's no way. There's no way this is real. Not one bit. So that's going to bring in a sort of lack of tension, I guess you could say. And of course, like I said, the flashiness factor kind of altogether, where a lot of this movie is montage. Because where Rounders is a movie about them constantly failing miserably, in 21 they're just gonna, there's no particular tension. They're always gonna be winning, because once again, the whole concept of 21 is that they know the outcome of the game. So all they can do to keep us entertained is to give us montage after montage after montage after montage after montage. And it's not even just that it's montage after montage after montage after montage and squared. There's also the whole thing about, we were talking about cliches a little bit ago. Yeah. Obviously, we're gonna get to the whole, the long rise to luxury that feels like it's an entire hour, the middle hour of this movie, and where the movie really kind of shows its overlength, and where we don't have to dwell on this as much as we do to make the point. Every now and then they throw a little something in there that's kind of funny, like when he gets so wrapped up in the luxury he forgets where he is sometimes, so when he's like back at school he tries to call room service in a sleepy haze. So there's stuff like that kind of keeps it alive, but then it just kind of goes back into montage after montage, and the stuff we've seen before, we know they're going to get way too luxurious, so eventually there has to be a downfall, and there's just, you can connect the dots way too early, so there is that. Even the misdirection I was talking about with Fishburne is still pretty, you can still kind of see it coming from a mile away, but I kind of like just the development in general. Like, I would like that development just as much if they just didn't hide it. Like, instead of, you know, Fishburne throwing that punch that doesn't land that we don't see right away, that's super suspicious. They could have just done the scene right then and there where he says, well, why don't you help me catch him? Because I guess they wouldn't have as much of an exciting climax, because when you realize that he's in with the security guys, it kind of makes the whole chase sequence at the end a bit pointless. When they part ways with Spacey, like when they're with Spacey, it makes sense. But when they part ways with Spacey, there's still a whole other segment of this scene, this climax, where we're watching them the people who were in on this getting chased by the security, they should by all means have all their focus on Spacey at this point because he's the fucking target. But okay. Like I said, it kind of drowns you in the flashiness of it to sort of drown out those very obvious problems and holes or whatever. So yeah, but every now and then the flashiness can be engaging because it gives the movie an energy that's you can't help but get wrapped up in anyway, even if you can see the problems with it clear as day. The movie still reaches moments where that style works and suits it and pays off in a bit. And some of the stylistic choices, like having him, at the table, and it's like he's practically at a standstill while everything's moving around him. Obviously, it's an age-old technique, but it suits the scene. And then when he goes outside, and we know he's been in there all night, so he's just blasted with sunlight, and like practically the whole screen goes white. It's stuff like that stylistically works. Like I said, kind of keeps the movie alive, even if the montages can be extremely draining and extremely redundant. And so there is that, but yeah, there is the whole thing where it's like really, it's sort of flashy to a fault, and it takes that approach where it's like, it's only flashy until it's not, and we see, the bad things that can happen to them. We see him get, screwed over by Lawrence Fishburne, and end up with nothing. After it's still getting the shit beat out of him. But eventually there's that sort of moral lesson there. And you could commend it for that, for not having it say, like, oh, these douchebags really shouldn't, get away with it. Even if, Jim Sturgis becomes a character that, we like on and off, and, he eventually, naturally loses his head in the luxury, it still would have felt like, that it just wouldn't have worked if they got away with something. So, that's great. And interestingly enough, on the other side of that, Rounders takes a totally different approach to itself, and you could say that it glamorizes dangerous gambling life and like that sort of addictive behavior in general, but it's like this movie has such a happy ending about itself despite where it ends up, and him saying, alright, so I got really close to losing my life. I lost so many things to gambling and all this stuff, and, poker in general. And it's like, the end scene could have been him going to Gretchen Mol and saying, like, it's over. I'm done. Like, you wait for that to happen. It's like, you think that's why he's there. And do the whole thing, and which it would have been stupid for her character anyway to believe that, because we know this character at this point. But he doesn't say, straight up, I'm done, like, that's it, I got really close there, so that was the last thing. That last game with Teddy KGB, the, give this man his money thing, it was all a nice bow wrapped up, but then it's like, no, you almost forgot, it's my fucking dream to go to the World Series of Poker and play, and that's what I'm going to do. That's where I'm going to go and be happy, is to continue this. And that is such a deviation from what a more cliche movie would have gone towards. I kind of love it. I really kind of love the ending of this. Like, it's so sort of refreshing when you see him go to Gretchen Mol and you expect the tired, okay, that's it, I'm done, and then he has to convince her that it's for real this time. Nothing like that. It is the exact opposite. And then it's like, it's like, you say, like, where are its morals, maybe, but it's like, it is like, the World Series of Poker, so it's like, yeah, the moral of the story is, as long as he doesn't gamble his life away, and as long as he doesn't gamble in the shady places, like, he probably had enough money at the beginning, to not go see Teddy KGB, but just to fucking go to the World Series of Poker, before all these, detours and all that eventually got him to this point where he had to learn a lesson before he's like, alright, time to make gambling a career now. And it's, yeah, so and it's like as long as he doesn't get himself killed, and as long as he doesn't lose everything, that could be a totally happy lifestyle for him. That's where he feels he belongs. Um, God forbid he runs back into Worm, because God knows what would happen with that. But the movie seems to suggest there's gonna be like kind of a, I think it suggests there's gonna be kind of like a distance between them now. So especially now that they're even. So there is that. And it's like the way it's often compared to like sports movies, as opposed to like when we started, I considered them like gambling movies, but it's like uh, it's been so like so many times over compared to like sports movies that it actually starts to make sense as the whole like he doesn't give up on the dream thing. It's a potentially more harmful dream than a lot of the others we see in movies that follow that similar formula. So it's like it takes well, 21 has so many beats that we recognize, and we're just waiting for it to get to all the stuff we already know is going to happen. Rounders also has a familiar formula. It's just not set in the world at all. That would be a desirable outcome for the the people that don't necessarily that aren't at least slightly worried about the fact that this is also a totally addictive lifestyle that could be totally damaging if he doesn't control himself. So there's that. And as far as the rest of 21, I do think there is strength in the scenes when Jim Sturgis and Rosa have like when a rivalry starts to form before he goes like full on antagonist, when it's just sort of a rivalry between them, and he goes back to the classroom and they're like speaking in code in front of the entire class. The stuff like that works. Like I said, the way they tie up him and his friends' conflict does work for me anyway. So, and like I said, the flashiness can tend to pay off, and there is a certain cool quality to the movie, even if it doesn't maybe quite get that to the levels that it clearly wants to. I still think this is still a movie I'll come back to occasionally for the various aspects of it that I do like. But I mean, as I've been pretty much saying through the whole thing, I think Rounders is much more of the just everything I've said about Rounders and how 21 kind of does everything maybe not near as well that Rounders is doing, and just the way Rounders almost sort of defies sort of the expectations of certain aspects of its story. It's while at the same time following a very familiar formula. It's not till it gets to the end we realize that it is that formula. It's the sports movie formula, which is crazy. So yes, much respect to Rounders, and yeah, I don't mind saying I still like 21 to certain degrees also. Just obviously not near as much as I did when it came out 11 years ago, going on 12 really. So, yeah, so that's going to be this one. The next thing is we're going to continue the Christmas thing with Elf. And then there's another Versus I kind of wanted to do that I've been putting off for a few months. And then reviews will be at the normal time, and award stuff will be coming, obviously, also with nominations coming out. So, all of that stuff. So, until all that stuff, I think that's it.